Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Seba Stovall is a master's student in the art history department at Georgia State University, which they just found out yesterday. Congratulations. Their work focuses on marginalization, intersexual feminism, and craft mediums. Please welcome Seba Stovall.
Hello, everybody. Hi. Oh, good. We have an interactive audience. I love that. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the lecture Queering Clay. My name is Seba Stovall, as Max said, and I use they, them pronouns. So, pronouns, you didn't think this was going to be a Gender Theory 101 lecture, but you're here now, so you better buckle up and enjoy the ride. All right, this lecture is titled Queering Clay. As you can see below, I opted for the shorter title. I wasn't sure if anyone would want to go to a lecture with that dense of a title, let alone if NCECO would let me publish it. But semantics aside, here are the important facts about me. I started my formal education as a ceramicist. I was fortunate enough to be taught at Georgia State University by Christina West and additional faculty. I graduated just prior to the inclusion of Darian Arakowski Johnson and Wesley Harvey to our department. I didn't initially even think about becoming an art historian. Since I began as a studio major, I hadn't considered the possibility of expanding into formal scholarly research. I wasn't discouraged from expanding my horizons, however. It just wasn't on my radar. But I was a ceramics materials nerd. I still am, just without my own kiln to experiment in. My plan was to research the historical development of ceramic materials and techniques, who affected the field, and what work was in process now. Over time, I became frustrated. It was comparatively easy to find information on drawing and painting, on monumental sculpture and abstract expressionism, on everything except ceramics and traditionally domestic craft. Within generalized art history text, I wanted to see discussions of pottery and ceramic sculpture published with the same depth and reverence that others use for oil painting or stone carving. And then I found out a version of the truth. Maybe it's not a global truth, but for me, it was real. In art history canon, ceramics is remembered for Judy Chicago's dinner party. From period history to Georgia O'Keeffe, Chicago represented a transformation of fiber arts through changing materials and styles. The ceramic elements didn't receive the same treatment. White porcelain dinnerware, carefully painted to represent a version of womanhood that is predictable. No red clay, very little brown tones, nothing unexpected. No iron reds, very few women of color, and only a socially acceptable amount of queerness. The dinner party leaves no place for a discussion of other identities, of transgender individuals, of queerness, and until intersectionality came into play, the feminist art movement didn't have much room for us either. We made our own place, starting with our own community. At NCECO 2017, a panel called Gendered Clay happened. Although I'm not intentionally piggybacking off of its coattails, it would be a lie to say that it didn't affect me or my decision to speak here today. At the end, during the discussion portion, one individual thanked the panel for speaking publicly. Representation is the lens through which unestablished artists view their future and their potential. And this individual had finally seen a positive reflection of themselves in art. Although my personal identities range from queer to transgender to non-binary and back to a tenuous lack of gender, I quickly learned that art history canon doesn't provide a representation of my identity, or at least not a positive one. For that audience member at NCECO 2017, and for me, the Gendered Clay panel was the kick in the pants to say that we had to stop relying on canon to represent us and start being the change we wanted to see. Historically, art brokers such as curators and workshop owners were the ones who advocated for the unknown makers, for the marginalized to have their art seen. Now, it's shifted. The artist speaks to their own community, and it's the arts writers and art historians who are charged with representing the art to the general public. That's where I come in. If I wanted to see queer ceramics and art history, I had to make my own canon. Google has rarely let me down, so I went to the internet with a medium in mind and pure stubbornness in my heart, searching queer ceramics, and gay ceramics, and lesbian ceramics, and every iteration of the LGBTQIA acronym until I had a list of ceramic artists who openly identified with a marginalized gender or sexuality, or at least sought to uproot normative gender roles. I've selected a number of these artists to show you today, and I know these artists are only a fraction of the queer makers here today or who exist in recent history. But there is diversity in these artworks, ranging from conceptual to outright satire to performance art. In the future, if I am able to repeat this discussion with a new point of view and more experience, I hope that there is a diversity of makers as well. More Black and brown people, a range of ethnicities and races, those with disabilities and those who are neurodivergent. But I can't do it without you. If you fit the label queer or LGBTQIA and work with clay, I invite you to make contact with me and make yourself known. The queer community needs to uplift each and every member if we are to make progress. We've existed, and we will continue to exist. The feminist art movement of the 1960s and 70s marched under the guise of community and family and protecting each other. It helped facilitate the social change that allowed identity politics and gender politics to become prominent in the art world. The feminist art movement and its echoes often excluded people of color and transgender individuals, but it's gotten better. Because of the repercussions of the feminist art movement, queer artists, ceramics or otherwise, can exist in public spaces. We queer artists are written into the canon under the guise of stealth and subtlety, under the terms exploring gender roles next to our cisgender and heterosexual colleagues using the same terminology. But sometimes we're loud and proud. While the socio-political climate of the 1960s to 90s failed to protect the queer community, today things are different, or at least they seem different. Change is occurring, slowly and gradually, because of queer ceramic artists who decades ago started paving the way for students who might be just now learning that queer ceramic artists exist. Today, we can be out. We can be happy and open. There are still barriers, but not the same as before. The saying goes, not gay isn't happy, but queer isn't FU. But today, we can be all the above. Loud and proud, expressing our intimacies and our art and pride, and we can be as political as our abilities allow. The recently trending hashtag, Pottery is Political, shows how important identity can be to artists. Mark Errol's vessels aren't aggressive. They aren't offensive or subjectively vulgar. But in the restrained surface decorations of his vessels, he includes images of men, gay men, and scenes of quiet intimacy. Regardless of his political affiliation or intention, that choice to represent gay men in a positive, healthy physical relationship is political. It challenges normative social expectations of heterosexuality. The queer community thrives through support from one another, positive representation, and acceptance of our individual identities. We set our own place at the table. As a clay community, we need to do so for queer ceramics. For me, concepts of art theory and gender theory seem to parallel each other. Like the queer community, ceramics is a community that supports difference and variety, while spreading tradition through interpersonal relationships. We're a family in a way, and we have room to support queer makers. Sometimes, your own queerness seems so obvious to outsiders, but the truth is that no one sits you down and tells you what your identity is. Sometimes, you have to go through the struggles, go through the anxiety and relationships and sheer drama before your queerness becomes apparent to you. You have to see it reflected in others, reflected in art, to understand what your own idiosyncrasies mean. When there is a lack of representation, a lack of information to help you describe how you feel, the word marginalized is not what comes to mind. Outsider, freak, problem, those are the tip of the insult iceberg. It's difficult to explain, but if you struggle with recognizing who you see in the mirror, with your self-image, imagine never seeing anyone who looks like you or makes artwork like yours. The goal of the established artist seems unattainable when you can't achieve the goal of being happy with your own reflection. Some of us make art that's loud and proud, where the themes of queerness cannot be ignored. We raise our voices to make room for ourselves at first, to solidify our own identity, then we speak louder to make room for our community. We start clearing a path for the others who will follow. In that gendered clay talk at NCECA 2017, someone spoke up from the audience. How many others were reached but remained silent? How many others were inspired and given hope by the simple inclusion of queer artists. And so, we change and grow and become more open as we see parts of ourselves represented in our ceramic community. We group together and make our own segments at NCECA. This year, the show Invisible is open at the Braddock Carnegie Library. It represents individuals whose diversity is often invisible or whose diversity is made to be invisible by society. On Thursday, you may have caught New Queers Eve, LGBT Clay panel, where artists discussed how their identity informs their work, or the Art of Otherness panel, which concerned how artists from marginalized backgrounds express their identity. See, we're making our own path. And so, although it was never overtly or publicly in question, queer makers and ceramicists exist. The lack of open representation makes it difficult for students and unestablished makers to see their future. It feels like we're forced to pick an aspect of ourselves that fits the narrative presented, that fits the expectations of ceramic art. We feel like we need to doctor ourselves, hide the pieces that are too queer for the general public. Culture is changing. It's making room for us, but not because we sat and waited for the acceptance. It's changing because members of the community are stepping up, doing everything they can to make things right. There's a saying, the first Pride March was a riot. As an arts writer and an art historian, I cannot sit back and let my queer narrative be subtle. I cannot pretend to be an activist for the queer ceramics community while overlooking a lack of diverse representation in art history canon or in art publications in general. And the open representation you see here at Pittsburgh, at this NCECA, maybe it's not a riot, but the queer community is at work. I'm here today to make a plea to the NCECA community and those who might listen to my presentation online. I know gender theory and the extent of the queer community is difficult to understand. What is easy to process is that your students need you. They need to see themselves represented. Do you remember learning about art history, hearing about famous painters, sculptors, and performers? When was it that you were introduced to ceramic artists, pottery, to something that you as a maker could relate to? Imagine that moment happening to one of your students, where they finally felt like they belong in this community. That they can make art and they can be successful, a revelation made real because of representation. Sometimes, a little inspiration is all that is needed. And I'm asking you, as educators, to help provide that push. You can be that gateway for another artist. It may not mean as much to you as it does to me or another queer maker, but it's important all the same. All we want is to be seen and recognized, so that future generations of makers don't feel lost in the crowds. And if my appeal doesn't change anything, we'll have to get more creative. But I guarantee you this, we're not leaving. We'll get louder. The representation of the queer community has been afforded in art history and public ceramic events like NCECA. We are grateful for it, but it is only the beginning. Diversity should be the norm, not the exception, whether we are referencing queerness or ethnicity or mental or physical ability. I will not stop speaking up about marginalization in this community. Use your chance to show us that you're allies on more than your social media feed. Today, I've shown a number of artists who identify on the LGBT spectrum or as queer, or whose work discusses gender roles. I've only shown artists who are outspoken about this aspect of marginalization, but there are many more who are not as identifiable. They may be closeted. They may be students and young artists. They may not want to make art about their identity, or they may not identify as queer or LGBT in public spaces. Those artists. I want you to feel recognized and heard as well. You are working quietly in the community, and there is no pressure to start making work that is loud and proud if you are unable. There are plenty of us who will speak up and be heard in your stead. My wish is for ceramics to be more adequately represented in art history. I'll write as many articles and publish as many papers as they'll let me until ceramics has just as many books, exhibitions, and representation as painting and drawing and non-clay sculpture. Until an art history book has more than Judy Chicago's Dinner Party listed under the medium of ceramics. I intend to do the same within the clay community for queer representation. NCECA 2018 is a year of diversity, community, and change. If you were waiting for a reason, any reason, to get involved, to promote marginalized communities, to speak up for your own identity, and to make your art, this is it. Thank you. All right, everybody. We'd like to open the floor for questions, and I was asked to remind you that you can use the mic right there in the middle. No takers? Okay. Oh, okay. Sure. So the question or the request was to speak more to allyship and what that looks like. In the queer community, and to clarify, I'm using queer as a sort of umbrella term, and I know some of you might not identify as queer, but in the queer community, what we really need is for people to listen to us, mostly. I'm trans, and I said I identify as queer, as non-binary, as agender. The most important thing I come across is pronouns, and that's a big one. But honestly, for makers who are not queer, if you are told something about the community, told that you need to respect the community in this way from an individual who is within the community, please take heed of it. It may not be pronouns, it may be sexuality, it may be touch, or like people not wanting to be hugged or something like that may have to do with part of their sexuality. But this kind of open communication between members of the in-group, and members of everyone else needs to happen for queer people, but also for any marginalized community. And that means race, ability, all of it. Make sense? Any others?
I've been hunting for non-binary pronouns in other languages. I'm
Yes.
from Canada, so French is the language we speak there, and I don't know if anybody knows because I speak French or Spanish, what French-speaking and Spanish-speaking people are using for they.
Okay. So the answer was in French. The answer is a mix of the words for he and she, which I'm not pronouncing because I can't. I barely speak Spanish, guys.
It's just like yell.
Okay, yell, but yield. Okay.
Anybody know in Spanish?
In Spanish, often folks to replace the A or O for feminine or masculine use an X instead.
But that's not a pronoun. That kind of just covers the ending of like a noun or something. That doesn't cover like pronouns. No, I totally understand what she's asking.
Yeah.
Cool.
Like I have a lot of Hispanic friends, but I've never heard them use pronouns like that.
They just use
But folks do.
They do?
Yeah, it's a thing.
Okay. I'm going to intervene here. I think it would be a lot easier for us to talk about this where we can write it down and maybe like say it in a place where everyone can hear. So I would happily continue this conversation afterwards. I'd love to hear the different ones, just because I know about replacing X, but I didn't know about the French one. Question.
No, this is a comment for the question about allyship.
Yes.
I work both for a mental health organization and also for a university. I teach ceramics.
Mhm.
And amazingly, my mental health company bosses started doing daily check-in. Whenever we have meetings, we go around and say our names, even though we know each other. And we always reiterate our preferred pronouns. And that's just become a corporate standard that we're open in that way to make it as normal and as accepted as possible. And so I've taken that into the classroom as well. And it's been like my students, especially first year college students, have often been very surprised by the question of, please, tell me what your preferred pronoun is. And it gives an opportunity to just be open in a way, just to make that a not weird thing. And also, it's given me an opportunity to introduce themes of queerness, gender identity, all these different things, as just, this is part of, as you said, this is part of diversity, this is part of normal, this is part of what should be known and done.
Yes. And I think, so the answer was that introduce or having in a setting of students or other professionals, introducing your pronouns immediately and maybe reiterating that every meeting you have, or at least frequently. That was the answer in order to normalize pronoun use or pronoun changes even then. With that, I think that's really fantastic, and I have been in a few organizations that do that. With that, I think the most important thing really comes back to my original answer, is that allyship is about listening. And so if you're in these groups where you do first things first, introduce your pronouns, allyship is remembering those pronouns and also trying to use those pronouns rather than making the mistake over and over again, because there is a reason why why pronouns are being introduced at the beginning. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Ginger Gentile. I go by Steve Hurt. I am the vice president for Camping Rose Pride up in the Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, and I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All of you. And it's really important for all of you to tell your stories. That's how we change minds. Let people know who you are, what you're about, and make incredible art. Let it go. Be happy with who you are.
Thank you. The comment for people listening at home who might not have heard that was that it's important for everyone here who is participating in this lecture to tell their stories and share their stories and do their best to, if they're able, to put themselves out there so that we can have more events like this where there's open communication and everyone can enjoy the representation. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. So you kind of touched on this before, but I wanted to ask a more pointed question for your thoughts. So how would one reconcile like conveying like the importance of like visibility and telling your story and so forth without like creating like an obligation or a burden like on marginalized groups to like be the ones educating?
To sum up the question, how would I go about working towards? Sorry, I'm trying to rephrase it again. Working towards these discussions where the burden of education doesn't fall on the marginalized individuals. So in our case, or in my case, like the queer individuals. Another case, in terms of race or ability. How would I do that, or how would I work towards that? Honestly, it's going to be a community effort. We should absolutely, as a community, try and work to educate people. And that is not to say that's what we need to do all the time. Personally, I believe you educate, or at least you try and educate as much as you can, but sometimes you just can't. Sometimes you know that your message is not being received. And at that point in time, that's when you call your allies and you call other queer people in, or anyone else you think that will stand up for you and help you. And at that point, the burden of education maybe can fall to a friend, or sometimes you just have to let it go. And sometimes people, and I don't mean let it go as in stop fighting the fight. I mean, let that person, whoever is making the mistake, have a chance to mull over what you've said. And even though that's really hard to do, if they make that mistake once, they're going to make it again. And someone else might be able to reach them, maybe because they've heard it once before from you. And I really wish that the burden of education wouldn't fall on marginalized communities, but unfortunately, since there's not a lot of material available for some of these issues, it falls enough to make it. And that's really why I'm the one up here instead of someone who is of a different race or maybe is transitioning different than what I am. And the reason why is I have that privilege as a white person who has the money and ability to stand up here and talk to you. I don't necessarily have any fear from kickback. I'm not going to be physically harmed by standing up here. And I'm trying to, because I am able, I'm trying to, like I said, make a path for everyone else who follows. I hope that in the future, if there's another queer talk, queer panel, etc., that is someone who is different from me and who can speak to their own experience. But since we didn't necessarily have a lot of representation in some of the other past NCECAs, we're starting it. That's the good thing. You're all here. Everyone here is asking great questions, and as we said, maybe in the future we can share our stories. And if you're able to do that, great. And I think that's really the important part, that we're here and we're trying. Any other questions? Yes.
I actually don't mind the burden of education. I'm involved in a lot of very specific things that when I tell people that I'm into them, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
Right.
So it's a great conversation starter. Yeah, it can be hard as hell.
Yeah.
But it is part of being okay with yourself. Talking about it to other people has helped me be okay with myself.
And that is a good point. To be okay with the burden of education, it's a great place to be, but also that does come with privilege for being for having that place where we can educate. And I think a lot of the issue that arises with the burden of education is that you need to do self-care. You need to like take care of yourself. You can't educate all the time. You'll get worn out, burned out. You can't educate 24/7. And if you are queer, but if you are also another marginalized group, that burden of education starts to wear a lot more. And that's really where allyship across, like intersectional allyship, comes into play.
So I have to bring up the point that putting the onus of that labor on marginalized identities is actually just reinforcing all of the oppressive systems that we're working against in the first place. And it's actually the job of folks with privilege to go out and do that work themselves. Because I can't be educating people my entire life. That is just exhausting, and it takes away from my ability to just like live my life and eat sandwiches.
Those sandwiches are very important.
While allyship is a super, super great place to start, it's only the first step. What we really need is accomplices. We need folks who are going to risk that privilege, who are going to risk that gatekeeping, who are going to put everything on the line that we have already sacrificed in order to bring that to the next step. We need folks to pass the mic and pass the plate. The collection plate, that is.
But if the resources aren't there for people, there's not a lot of resources on this
Google's
stuff.
been there.
Who's gonna put the resources out there?
There's actually
Folks with marginalized identities have been putting those resources out there since time immemorial. Black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks and disabled folks and queer folks have been telling these stories since the beginning of time, and pretending like they're not is a disservice to our ancestors. The information is there, it has always been.
And it is really important to reach out to your local community and actually try and find these, or whatever community you're in, whether it's here at Pittsburgh and NCECA or your local community where you live, and try and find these resources. I don't know if you noticed, but I'm from Atlanta. I live not far from downtown Atlanta. There's a lot of community centers where I am who who help and involve people of color, specifically black people, and in that vein, they also try and include a lot of queer people of color. And it's not my job to try and be the person who is an ally. It's my job to be the accomplice. And so I think there's really both. And there, actually, I haven't heard the term accomplice. It's very interesting. But it's really part of both, where you can work together and be that ally, but also you have to put your privilege on the line. And that is true. Maybe not for me personally, standing in front of you at NCECA. My privilege is not necessarily on the line with this. I might get writing jobs from it, which is fantastic. But this is only the beginning for me. Like I said, I'm working towards writing about really as many people as I can who are queer in this community. Any other questions before we round it up? Last one. The question was, do I have resources for the queer ceramics community or queer potters that I can provide, or is that the point of this lecture? And honestly, yes, it's the point of this lecture. I would love to try and organize information, organize resources, and I have made so many connections to NCECA with a lot of queer artists, and I will. If you want to follow me on social media, send me an email, send me your story. I'd be happy. Or if you have resources for me, send them to me. I will be happy to try and work on that. And if you would like to email me that question to make sure I do follow through and don't completely forget, I would love that. All right. Thank you, everybody. If you want to talk to me, I'll be outside.